If you were to tell me that one of the characters from Nightreign was a painter, I probably wouldn't have imagined this individual. Executor can sometimes be found in the garden area of the Round Table Hold. The figure in copper armour sits before a canvas. Mine flesh, partially plated. Mine hand with brush, a window into oneself. Brushstrokes outline these fragments of memory. They appear to be painting the Erd tree. However, if you look around, there is no Erd tree here, which is quite a significant shock for any of us familiar with the world of Elden Ring, as we often regard it as one of our most significant landmarks in the world. Now, as part of Executor's story, it begins with him speaking to the Guardian, who confirms this.
I heard that in the lands between, there was once a thing of wonder known as the Erd tree. The monolithic tree was said to be a symbol of the land's blessings. Did you ever see it for yourself?
This use of the past tense is really interesting, because the question that immediately comes to mind is, well, what happened to the Erd tree? I'll touch on more of this as we go. The Erd tree. I am an artist from the distant land of reeds, washed up on the shore, inspired by what I saw, but the piece is incomplete. It's missing. In Elden Ring, there have been several references to a place known as the Land of Reeds, and it is fitting that Executor also originates from there. As we know, katana-wielding individuals tend to hail from the Land of Reeds, Yura and Okina, for instance. Thus, Executor most likely fled from the civil war that was ravaging the homeland, arrived at the lands between, and beheld the magnificent Erd tree. So we know it existed at some point. Now, before anyone starts commenting, actually, Chalice, Nightreign is non-canon, so everything you're saying doesn't change anything. Nothing ever changes. First of all, I know. Secondly, let's be more specific. I'm aware that in an interview with Ishizaki, Nightreign's director, he confirmed that Nightreign does share the same base setting as the world of Elden Ring, but some phenomenon occurred in the story that caused an alternate timeline, hence what you play as in Nightreign. So I won't be focusing on how Nightreign relates to Elden Ring in a timeline context, but I will be discussing established concepts that it pulls from, like powers and orders in the world. As the Duchess puts it, the Executor is familiar with the old Golden Realm, which might refer to when the Erd tree was casting its golden light, and the Golden Order, all those good times. She also mentions that he has an eye for beauty, which is a quite wholesome statement, so she asks him to bring her some flowers. Flowers, an embracing warmth from the flowers, the same flowers that grew in my painter's shed. I am an artist painting the Erd tree. I am a guest bearing a sword. I am silent. I am a witness. Here we gain insight into the mindset of what Executor thinks of himself. An artist, this has been established. A guest, which is interesting wording. Perhaps this refers to his arrival in the Round Table Hold, or possibly it's an introspective view of himself. A guest is only temporary, only visiting, in a space that is not theirs. Furthermore, Executor refers to himself as a silent witness, which explains why he doesn't speak when you try to converse with him when playing a different Nightfarer, and how all the dialogue options are non-verbal. Additionally, the term witness suggests a rather passive demeanour. This will be important later. The next chapter in the journal goes on to say, "The guest. I am a guest. Or perhaps an executioner. The guest speaks. I will wait until your Erd tree is complete." Because of the poetic language in which this is written, it can be somewhat difficult to understand what his journal entries mean at times. However, my understanding is that the Executor has these different labels which he identifies himself with, such as artist, guest, or witness. So when he says, "I am a guest," the guest says this, he means he is saying that. What he appears to be doing is engaging in this conversation with facets of himself in his mind and in his poetry. And here specifically, he's saying he is waiting for himself to complete the Erd tree painting. We'll return to his psyche a bit later. Now, the Executor is tasked with collecting flowers, specifically altus flowers, flush with nutrients and grace. Before, such flowers were commonplace on the Altus Plateau. The vibrant hues suggest the flowers received plenty of sunlight, and appear to shine in an ode to the resplendent Erd tree. So here we have another location that some of us are quite familiar with, Altus Plateau, a stunning golden area in Elden Ring, and these flowers must have grown here, absorbing the rays of the Erd tree. Upon collecting the flowers, Duchess instructs you to take them to the Iron Menial, who is essentially the marionette caretaker of the Round Table Hold in this universe. I just adore him, our eloquent domestic granddad.
Look here, my pride and joy, now in full bloom. Life finds purchase, even here. Just gazing at them gives me a measure of peace. Oh, what's that you have there?
He seems to enjoy flowers as well, and the blessed ones you've just collected will actually be planted in the garden, now providing this lovely splash of colour. Old friend, the Erd tree was still incomplete, and so I drew a sketch in solace of an old friend from the land of reeds, who speaks not a word. I will entrust it to my guest. I cannot complete the Erd tree before another executioner arrives in the first one's stead. What is particularly nice about the journal is the sketches that illustrate some of the entries. Here we see what appears to be the Executor's katana propped up in a shadowy alcove of the Round Table Hold. Now this journal entry really starts to feel fragmented, so let's try and break it down. He writes that he drew a sketch of a friend from the land of reeds who speaks not a word. This could refer to the sword. The katana, as we know, originates from the island in the east, and swords don't typically tend to talk. The entry states that he will leave it for his guest, which we theorized refers to him, and with the sketch illustrating what he means, it seems that he has written something of a reminder note for himself. The last line is somewhat unusual though, stating that he cannot complete the Erd tree painting until another executioner arrives to replace the first one. In one's stead means to do in place of someone. As we know, the Executor has referred to himself as an executioner, so does this line imply that he's waiting for another before he can continue? This all makes sense in a little bit, so bear with me. So you actually have the option to sit and paint when you are playing as Executor. However, as you take up the brush, voice echoes within you.
What's done is done. The Erd tree is no more. What is lost can never return.
This voice is presumably the Executor's thoughts, providing straight-up confirmation that the Erd tree no longer exists. However, there is also a deeper implication here. The Crucible Knight, a portrait of my guest, perhaps my executioner. Crucible holds a composite. My guest could not bear to render a judgment here at the painter's shed, overlooking the Erd tree until the very end. In this twist, we learn that the Executor was a Crucible Knight at some point, which makes a great deal of sense. We know that when he arrived in the lands between, he became obsessed with the Erd tree, and it stands to reason that he would seek a role that furthered this worship, which is precisely what Crucible Knights are all about. They can wield aspects of the Crucible, abilities that manifest the Erd tree's primal vital energies. For instance, they can grow a golden tail to whip around or dive using bird wings. The Crucible is about the blending of life and living beings. Thus, it's possible that the Executor, one of these beings, perhaps he didn't realize it until he observed the Erd tree and felt something move within him. Alternatively, discovering the existence of an order of Crucible Knights may have validated his understanding of the powers he possessed. The Executor's ultimate art is an aspect of the Crucible, however, it's something new that we haven't really encountered before, simply referred to as Beast. We have witnessed numerous different renditions of what Crucible powers look like, but for the most part, if you are human, you typically gain additional animal parts. Alternatively, you might be a creature blended with other creatures' traits, such as the golden hippopotamus, also having these porcupine-like attributes. However, the Executor is a unique case because by default he inhabits this humanoid form, yet can physically transform entirely into a different being. It's very all-consuming. Interestingly, the Executor's character description details that his body fused with pieces of armor. The color scheme and texture of his armor are similar to that of the armor worn by Crucible Knights, and it appears almost chitinous. One could theorize that perhaps something triggered the Executor's transformation into this beast form, resulting in his body melding with the armor in the process. Back to the journal. This passage will make much more sense when you begin the remembrance attached to this entry. However, as a brief summary so far, the Crucible Knight, the Guest, and the Executioner are all one and the same, the Executor. But he has yet to really acknowledge this. Something happened at the painter's shed, the place he once frequented while gazing at the Erd Tree. And as the next step of this quest, you must retrieve a golden sprout from the small illusory tree. This seed sprouted despite the harshness of its environment, like youthful potential blossoming in the crucible of adversity, or what may be called a miracle. The description of this seed accurately reflects the Executor's situation, and as you hand it over to the Duchess, you actually get this really cool cutscene specifically for the Executor.
Behold its majesty. It never fails to move me.
However, it is not you who is speaking here. That's another Executor. The Executor you are playing as gradually comes into view, and you will confront yourself in this mini-boss battle.
I will curtail the threat that awaits us. And let any who dare disturb such peace face my blade.
This fight works really well due to Executor's playstyle, parrying and slashing each other. This mirror match is both literal and metaphorical. The final words from the other Executor foreshadow what is about to transpire.
And yet still you search. Foolish other self. Then I ask that you live without averting your gaze.
As this Nightfarer's remembrance system involves reliving the memories each character has forgotten, suppressed, the memory doesn't just end after you win the fight. If you walk around this area, you discover what happened to the Executor. A shack with an easel outside. This is presumably the painter's shed, as referenced in the journal. However, just before the entrance lies the body of a Crucible Knight. Blood is smeared across the floor and the canvas. Following the trail inside, you see another Crucible Knight, but this one is alive, kneeling with a hand outstretched towards a figure curled on the floor. This person lies in the fetal position. Their robes are stained. They don't move. After a moment, the knight rises, draws their sword and plunges it into their own body. Crucible Knight, a portrait of my guest, or perhaps my executioner. We can deduce that the knight in this memory is the Executor, based on many facts. One, for example, they wield a long katana and perform the Ash of War seppuku, forbidden technique used by swordsmen from the Land of Reeds, which is likely what he was alluding to by calling himself his own executioner. So what actually occurred here? Well, that really depends on the identities of the other individuals in this memory. We simply don't know who they were or their relationship. We'll have to read between the lines a bit here. The individual curled on the floor of the shack appears to be wearing the Travelling Maiden set. Was this Executor's maiden, or more likely, simply a lady he cared for? Through some means, she perished, which prompted the Executor to commit the forbidden act, presumably out of shame for not being able to save her. Crucible holds a composite. My guess could not bear to render a judgment. A composite can refer to something made up of different parts, which is a clever way of referring to how fragmented Executor's identity is, especially as he goes on to refer to himself as a guest and how he could not process what was going on here. But how did this maiden die in the first place? From the clues at the scene, it appears that someone was attacked near the easel due to the blood splatter and the trail that leads inside. The deceased Crucible Knight is also positioned near the easel, suggesting it could be their blood. However, they are found lying facing down, oriented towards the scene. This implies that they did not die while fleeing, as their body would have been turned in the opposite direction. Therefore, they must have been facing the crime scene at the time of their death. If this Crucible Knight was the one who harmed the maiden, then the position of their corpse could indicate that they were the one who struck her while she was standing outside, perhaps even painting herself. Upon being attacked, she would have limped into the shack and fallen to the floor, leaving this trail of blood behind. At this time, the Executor must have arrived, having likely witnessed these events unfold. He would have confronted his fellow knight and defeated him. As for what motivated the Crucible Knight to act in this manner in the first place is never explained. Perhaps there was some form of love triangle involved, maybe the maiden rejected him, perhaps the Crucible Knight truly did not appreciate art, or that blood on the floor could have been the Executor's. Perhaps he was the one standing by the easel painting, but was wounded when this other Crucible Knight interrupted and somehow went on to harm his lady. Maybe Executor accidentally hurt them both. We simply don't know. I think it's also important to mention that at some point in the Executor's life, he went missing after a prison stint in the lands between. At some point, the Executor was sentenced to prison for a crime, but managed to escape at some point. We can only speculate on what this crime was. Perhaps the most logical assumption is that he was apprehended after defeating this Crucible Knight. Could it be that he actually failed to do a fatal wound to himself, despite how it looks in this memory? I mean, it would explain why he's still alive in the game we play. I know Elden Ring takes some poetic license when it comes to the resurrection system, so he could have been brought back to life for the purpose of Nightreign, kind of like how the Tarnished is at the start of that game. However, if the Executor somehow managed to survive his botched seppuku, his murder of the Crucible Knight might have been considered extremely blasphemous, given that they are soldiers of Lord Godfrey, and perhaps he was also imprisoned for the murder of that lady in the shack. So half dead, he was taken to prison. Now how he went missing, we'll also have to speculate. But if he was able to use his crucible powers at this point and transform into a beast, I don't think that any cell could have held him, nor do I think anyone would have recognized that that was the prisoner, hence why he was reported missing. Or could it be that the prison stint actually occurred when he arrived in the lands between? Perhaps he was captured upon arrival, or maybe he did something for his own survival that resulted in his imprisonment. Alternatively, he might not have had control over his crucible powers and went missing in prison, but in reality he was brought into the Crucible Knights for a fresh start. Regardless of all these theories, what is certain that what happened at the shack was a massive betrayal and heartbreak for the Executor. His comrade, a fellow Crucible Knight, and the woman he cared deeply for both perished, and in a way so did he. Perhaps this also explains why the Executor's sword is referred to as cursed. Another cursed blade we know of is Rivers of Blood, belonging to Okina, a demon swordsman who felled countless men, and it's not far to say that some of them may have been his own. The Executor found the sword abandoned in the aftermath of a battle and has wielded it ever since, stained with gold and rusted blood. I like to think that the sword became cursed upon felling both his friend and himself, with the gold referenced coming from their armors. However, the katana we see the Crucible Knight in the memory wielding looks nothing like Executor's. A lot longer and thinner and doesn't have that piece of fabric around it, but maybe at this point it became cursed, somehow changing shape and size. I think it's really meaningful that after completing the remembrance, the Iron Menial notices something has changed about the cursed sword.
The blade you wear upon your hip is not the same as it once was. Not in outward appearance, but in its very being. I wonder why I feel so strongly this must be true. Perhaps it is because I too reside in a frame inanimate.
Earlier I mentioned how the Executor referred to it as an old friend who doesn't speak. At first I took that as just poetry, but maybe there's some truth to it. The Menial is, after all, an inanimate object brought to life by magic, gaining a consciousness. He hints that something similar may now be true of our weapon. Perhaps the sword has regained its voice because it remembers too, sharing the weight of the Executor's memories as he wields it.
We've reclaimed the light of grace. We owe this to you. Thank you, truly. But what's this wound? From your memories.
Upon completing the Remembrance quest, you actually unlock a new appearance for Executor. Now this one is among the more subtle of the Nightfarer's Remembrance skins, but if you look at his midsection, you will actually see there is now a horizontal cut through his armor, a nod to the forbidden act he committed, but now acknowledges. And now you will find the last entry in the journal, reading, "The Executor, 2 faces, 1 sword, such is my nature, a soul drenched in blood, yet willing to face the night. Perhaps, when the night has passed, I will complete the Erdtree." 2 faces, 1 sword is such a lovely reference to the fact that Executor has 2 forms, human and beast. It could also refer to the fact that he had to confront his other self, his other face, to uncover the truth. I particularly appreciate that his other self urged him to live without averting his gaze, meaning he should not look away from the truth, nor run away from the past. Now is the time to remember what is painful, to embrace it, and then to move forward, no longer allowing it to hurt or inhibit him any longer. Completing the painting was evidently a difficult task. As I suggested earlier, perhaps the blood trail is indicative that the maiden was the one painting when she was attacked. Perhaps they were both artists. That is how they made their deep bond. However, after her death and losing his memories, Executor felt increasingly drawn to the painting, desiring to complete it, yet unsure of the reason why. Now, having remembered and accepted who he is and who he was, not a guest, not a witness, but the Executor, he will finish that painting one day. After all, the word Executor can mean someone who ensures the wishes of the deceased.